Colorado Territory, 1885. 7 brides descended from an ornate carriage outside St. Catherine's Church, their white gowns catching the morning light like fresh snow against the valley's golden landscape. Each woman carried a single red rose, their faces radiant with hope and anticipation. They had traveled from different corners of the country to marry the prosperous Blackwood brothers, owners of the largest ranch and mining operation in Millbrook Valley. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What none of these women knew was that within 72 hours, their joy would transform into something far darker. A tragedy so profound that it would bind them together, not as sisters-in-law celebrating new beginnings, but as widows plotting the most elaborate revenge the Colorado Territory had ever witnessed. The 7 Blackwood brothers thought they had secured perfect wives to bear their legacy. Instead, they had unknowingly invited their own destruction into their home. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers as Grace Morrison stepped carefully from the carriage, her silk wedding dress rustling against the wooden step. At 24, she possessed an understated elegance that came from years of managing her deceased father's medical practice in Boston. Her dark auburn hair was arranged in an intricate style beneath a pearl-adorned veil, and her green eyes sparkled with nervous excitement. She had corresponded with Marcus Blackwood for 8 months, drawn to his articulate letters describing life in the untamed West and his vision for building something meaningful in Millbrook Valley. Clara Henderson emerged next, her blonde curls catching sunlight as she adjusted her lace gloves. The daughter of a railroad engineer from Chicago, she had always possessed the adventurous spirit that conventional society found unseemly in a proper young lady. At 22, she was the youngest of the brides, but her bright blue eyes held an intelligence that had impressed Daniel Blackwood during their lengthy correspondence. Her wedding dress, while simpler than Grace's, was crafted with meticulous attention to detail, reflecting her practical nature. Ruth Campbell descended with the measured grace of someone accustomed to managing large households. At 27, she was the eldest of the brides, having served as her widowed uncle's housekeeper in Philadelphia after her parents' death in a factory fire. Her brown hair was pulled back severely, but her warm brown eyes softened her stern features. Benjamin Blackwood had written extensively about needing a capable woman to help manage the domestic aspects of the ranch, and Ruth had responded with detailed plans for organizing the household staff and establishing proper social customs in their frontier community. Helen Porter stepped down with quiet dignity, her mouse-brown hair and reserved demeanor masking a sharp intellect honed by years as a schoolteacher in a rough mining town in Pennsylvania. At 25, she had grown weary of the isolation and limited prospects her profession offered, longing for a partnership that would value her education and capabilities. Samuel Blackwood's letters had painted a picture of a man who appreciated intellectual conversation and respected women's contributions beyond mere domestic duties. Anna Sullivan moved with the confident stride of someone unaccustomed to being underestimated. The red-haired daughter of Irish immigrants, she had worked in her family's bakery in New York City since childhood, developing both business acumen and a fierce determination to succeed. At 23, she possessed a fiery temperament that Nathan Blackwood claimed to find refreshing after years of dealing with what he called simpering society ladies. Her emerald wedding dress reflected her bold personality and the modest prosperity her family had achieved through hard work. Mary O'Brien stepped carefully onto the wooden walkway, her gentle nature evident in every movement. The daughter of a respected minister from a small town in Ohio, she had spent her 26 years caring for orphan children and assisting with church activities. Her soft voice and compassionate demeanor had impressed Jonathan Blackwood, who wrote of wanting a wife who would bring spiritual guidance and moral grounding to the rough frontier community. Her simple wedding dress reflected her humble background, but her serene expression suggested an inner strength that went beyond mere piety. Elizabeth Hayes emerged last, her regal bearing immediately commanding attention. At 28, she was a widow whose first husband had died in a mining accident after only 2 years of marriage, leaving her with modest means but valuable experience in frontier life. Her chestnut hair was arranged in a sophisticated style, and her gray eyes held a worldliness that set her apart from the other brides. Alexander Blackwood, the youngest of the brothers at 25, had been drawn to her maturity and independence, qualities he claimed would complement his ambitious plans for expanding the family's business interests. The 7 women gathered on the church steps, their different backgrounds and personalities evident even in these first moments. Father Patrick O'Connor emerged from the stone building, his kind face beaming with pleasure at the sight of the assembled brides. A robust man in his 50s with graying hair and twinkling blue eyes, he had served the Millbrook Valley community for over a decade, performing marriages, baptisms, and funerals for families scattered across hundreds of square miles of challenging terrain. "Welcome, dear ladies," he said warmly, his Irish accent still noticeable after years in America. "The entire valley has been anticipating your arrival. The Blackwood brothers speak of nothing else, and the community is eager to welcome 7 new families to our growing settlement." Grace stepped forward as the unofficial spokesperson for the group, a role that had naturally evolved during their shared journey from Denver. "Father O'Connor, we're honored to be here. The journey was long, but the mountains are more beautiful than any of us imagined." The priest nodded enthusiastically. "Indeed they are, child. And you'll find that beauty extends to the people here as well. The Blackwood family has been the backbone of this community since they arrived 15 years ago. Their ranch provides employment for dozens of families, and their mining operations have brought prosperity to the entire region." Clara's curiosity got the better of her reserved nature. "Father, might we meet our intended husbands before the ceremony? We've traveled so far based on letters and photographs, but it would ease our nerves to speak with them in person." Father O'Connor's expression grew slightly puzzled. "Why, child, the brothers departed for Denver 3 days ago to escort you here personally. Did you not encounter them during your journey?" The 7 women exchanged confused glances. Grace frowned, reviewing the details of their trip. "We received word at the Denver hotel that business had detained them, and that we should proceed directly to Millbrook Valley for the ceremony. A Mr. Henry Ford met us at the station and arranged our transportation." "Henry Ford, our telegraph operator," Father O'Connor mused, his brow furrowing. "That's unusual, but Marcus and his brothers are men of significant responsibilities. Perhaps an urgent matter arose with the cattle or mining operations. Such things happen frequently in this country." Ruth, ever practical, stepped forward. "Father, might we freshen ourselves before the ceremony? The journey was dusty, and we'd like to present ourselves properly." "Of course, dear. Mrs. Winters has prepared rooms at her boarding house specifically for this purpose. She's also organized a small reception following the ceremony. Nothing elaborate, but fitting for welcoming new families to our community." Margaret Winters appeared as if summoned, a sturdy woman in her 40s with graying brown hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put the nervous brides at ease. As the owner of the general store and unofficial social coordinator for Millbrook Valley, she had taken charge of the wedding preparations with characteristic efficiency. "Come along, ladies," she said briskly but kindly. "I've prepared 7 rooms with fresh water, clean linens, and everything you'll need to prepare for your special day. The ceremony is scheduled for 2 o'clock, giving you time to rest and compose yourselves." The boarding house, a 2-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch, sat adjacent to the general store on Millbrook Valley's main street. The interior was simple but clean, with handmade furniture and colorful quilts that spoke of a community that valued both practicality and beauty. Each bride was shown to her own small but comfortable room, complete with a washstand, mirror, and fresh flowers from local gardens. Grace settled into her room, carefully hanging her wedding dress to prevent wrinkles while examining her reflection in the small mirror. The journey had been exhausting, involving 3 different trains, an overnight stay in Denver, and finally the bone-jarring carriage ride through mountain passes to reach Millbrook Valley. Yet despite her fatigue, she felt a nervous excitement about finally meeting Marcus Blackwood in person. Their correspondence had begun the previous autumn when a mutual acquaintance in Boston had suggested they might be compatible. Marcus had written eloquently about his vision for expanding the family ranch, his desire for an intelligent wife who could help manage both domestic and business affairs, and his appreciation for education and cultural refinement. Grace had been impressed by his thoughtful letters, his obvious success in a challenging environment, and his respectful approach to courtship. Down the hall, Clara paced restlessly in her room, too excited to rest despite her exhaustion. Daniel Blackwood's letters had described a man of action and adventure, someone who appreciated a woman with spirit and independence. He had written about cattle drives, encounters with wildlife, and the daily challenges of frontier life with an enthusiasm that had ignited her own sense of adventure. After years of feeling constrained by Chicago society's expectations for proper young ladies, the prospect of a marriage that would allow her to experience true freedom seemed almost too good to be true. Ruth methodically unpacked her few belongings, mentally reviewing the detailed plans she had developed for managing the Blackwood household. Benjamin's letters had indicated that the family employed several dozen workers at the ranch and mining operations, creating complex logistical challenges for feeding, housing, and coordinating their activities. Ruth had spent months researching efficient household management techniques, menu planning for large groups, and strategies for maintaining order in busy multi-generational family compounds. Helen sat quietly by her window, gazing out at the magnificent mountain scenery while reviewing her expectations for the marriage. Samuel Blackwood had written extensively about his desire for intellectual companionship, his interest in establishing a proper school for the children of ranch workers, and his appreciation for literature and philosophical discussion. After years of teaching in environments where her gender limited her advancement opportunities, the prospect of a partnership that would value her mind as well as her domestic capabilities filled her with hopeful anticipation. Anna stood before her mirror, adjusting her emerald dress and mentally preparing for what she hoped would be a successful business partnership as much as a marriage. Nathan Blackwood's letters had described ambitious plans for expanding the family's commercial enterprises, including potentially establishing businesses in Denver and other growing cities throughout the territory. Anna's experience with her family's bakery had taught her valuable lessons about inventory management, customer relations, and financial planning that she hoped to contribute to the Blackwood enterprises. Mary knelt beside her narrow bed, offering prayers of gratitude for safe travel and petitions for wisdom in the new life ahead. Jonathan Blackwood had written movingly about his desire to establish charitable works in the community, his concern for the spiritual welfare of the ranch workers and their families, and his hope for a wife who would share his commitment to service. After years of working with orphan children and struggling families, Mary felt prepared to help build institutions that would serve the region's growing population. Elizabeth, drawing on her experience as a widow who had successfully managed her late husband's mining claims, examined her new circumstances with a practical eye. Alexander Blackwood's letters had described someone young but ambitious, eager to prove himself worthy of his older brother's respect through expanding the family's business interests. Elizabeth's hard-won knowledge of mining operations, contract negotiations, and frontier business practices would hopefully prove valuable in helping him achieve those goals. At 1 o'clock, Mrs. Winters knocked on each door, summoning the brides to gather in the boarding house parlor for final preparations. The 7 women descended the stairs in their wedding finery, creating a striking tableau of different personalities, united by shared anticipation and nervous excitement. "Ladies," Mrs. Winters announced with obvious pride, "you all look absolutely beautiful. The Blackwood brothers are the luckiest men in Colorado Territory. Now Father O'Connor is waiting at the church, and I've arranged for carriages to transport you there in proper style." Grace adjusted her veil one final time, taking a deep breath to calm her nerves. "Mrs. Winters, might we ask about our intended husbands? We're naturally curious about the men we're about to marry, and we haven't had the opportunity to meet them yet." Mrs. Winters' expression grew slightly puzzled, echoing Father O'Connor's earlier confusion. "Why, dear, I assumed you would have met during your journey from Denver. The brothers mentioned they planned to escort you personally." Clara stepped forward, her journalistic instincts sensing something unusual in the repeated misunderstanding. "We were told they were detained by business matters and would meet us at the church. Is it common for them to change plans so suddenly?" "Well," Mrs. Winters said slowly, clearly thinking through the implications, "the Blackwood brothers are men of significant responsibilities. Cattle don't wait for convenient timing, and mining operations require constant attention. I'm sure they had excellent reasons for any change in plans." Ruth, ever practical, asked the question that had been troubling several of the brides. "Mrs. Winters, what can you tell us about the Blackwood family? We've learned much through letters, but it would help to understand their place in the community." Mrs. Winters brightened, clearly pleased to discuss one of Millbrook Valley's most prominent families. "Oh, my dear, the Blackwoods are the foundation of our entire community. Marcus, the eldest, manages the ranch operations with incredible skill. Daniel oversees the cattle drives and handles relations with other ranchers throughout the region. Benjamin manages the mining operations, which employ nearly half the men in the valley. Samuel handles the family's business dealings and serves as an unofficial mayor for our community." She paused to gather her thoughts before continuing. "Nathan manages the family's commercial enterprises, including contracts for supplying beef to military installations and mining camps throughout Colorado Territory. Jonathan oversees the workers' housing and ensures that families employed by the Blackwood enterprises have adequate shelter and provisions. And Alexander, though the youngest, has already proven himself invaluable in expanding the family's mining claims and establishing new business partnerships." Anna listened carefully, impressed by the scope of the family's operations. "They sound remarkably organized and successful. How long has the family been established here?" 15 years now," Mrs. Winters replied with obvious admiration. "They arrived with nothing but determination and vision, claiming land when it was still dangerous due to conflicts with local tribes. Through hard work and fair dealing, they've built something truly impressive while treating their workers and neighbors with respect and generosity." Elizabeth, drawing on her experience with frontier communities, asked a more pointed question. "Are they well regarded by other prominent families in the region? Sometimes successful men make enemies through their very success." Mrs. Winters hesitated for just a moment before responding, and Helen's trained observation skills caught the brief pause. "The Blackwoods command respect throughout Colorado Territory. Their word is their bond, and they've never failed to honor their commitments to workers, business partners, or community obligations." The slight hesitation suggested there might be complexities that Mrs. Winters was diplomatically avoiding. But before any of the brides could pursue the matter further, Father O'Connor appeared in the parlor doorway. "Ladies, if you're ready. The carriages are waiting. The entire community has gathered to witness this joyous occasion, and I'm sure you're eager to finally meet your intended husbands." The 7 women gathered their skirts and bouquets, following Father O'Connor outside, where 2 elegant carriages waited to transport them to St. Catherine's Church. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, and mountains rose majestically on all sides, creating a setting of breathtaking natural beauty for what should have been the happiest day of their lives. As they settled into the carriages for the short journey to the church, Grace found herself seated next to Elizabeth, whose experience as a widow provided a different perspective on marriage and frontier life. "Elizabeth," Grace said quietly, "you've been married before. What advice would you offer someone approaching marriage with a man she's never met in person?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully, her gray eyes thoughtful. "Trust your instincts. Grace, letters can reveal character and intentions, but they can also conceal important truths. Pay attention to how a man treats others, particularly those who depend on him for their livelihoods. A man's character is revealed not in his treatment of equals, but in his treatment of those who have less power." The wisdom resonated with Grace, who had observed similar patterns during her years assisting with her father's medical practice. Wealthy patients often behaved very differently toward her father than they did toward his assistants or the families who struggled to pay their bills. In the second carriage, Clara found herself listening to a conversation between Ruth and Mary about their expectations for married life in such an isolated community. "I confess," Mary said quietly, "I'm somewhat nervous about the remoteness of this place. In Ohio, I was never more than a day's journey from family or close friends. Here, we'll be entirely dependent on our husbands and their community for social support." Ruth nodded understandingly. "I've considered that as well. It makes the success of our marriages even more crucial, since we won't have the option of returning to family if difficulties arise. We'll need to build strong relationships with each other and with the other women in the community." Clara, whose adventurous spirit had been excited by the prospect of frontier isolation, found their concerns thought-provoking. She had focused primarily on the freedom and adventure that frontier life promised, giving less consideration to the challenges of being separated from all familiar support systems. The carriages rounded a bend in the road, bringing St. Catherine's Church into view. The stone building stood proudly against the mountain backdrop, its bell tower reaching toward the azure sky. Dozens of people had gathered in the churchyard, their Sunday best creating a colorful celebration despite the weekday timing. Children darted between adult groups, their excitement adding to the festive atmosphere. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the carriages drew closer, Grace noticed something that made her heart skip with nervous anticipation. 7 men stood in a line on the church steps, their formal attire and position suggesting these were indeed the Blackwood brothers. Even at a distance, she could see they were all tall, broad-shouldered men who carried themselves with the confidence that came from success and authority. The carriages stopped before the church, and Father O'Connor stepped forward to assist. The brides in alighting. One by one, the 7 women emerged, their wedding dresses creating a vision of beauty and hope that drew appreciative murmurs from the assembled community members. Grace looked toward the church steps where the 7 men waited, searching for some sign of which might be Marcus. The eldest appeared to be a man with dark hair and an air of command, his eyes scanning the assembled brides with an expression that seemed more assessing than romantic. Beside him stood a blond man with laughing blue eyes who was grinning with obvious pleasure, his gaze settling on Clara with immediate approval. The third brother possessed a more serious demeanor, his brown hair carefully styled and his posture suggesting someone accustomed to responsibility and order. His attention focused on Ruth with what appeared to be satisfaction at her mature, capable appearance. Next to him stood a man with scholarly features, wire-rimmed spectacles, and an intellectual bearing that immediately identified him as Samuel to Helen's trained eye. The fifth brother had reddish-brown hair and a restless energy that seemed barely contained by formal clothing and ceremony. His gaze found Anna with obvious appreciation for her spirited bearing and bold choice in dress color. Beside him, a gentle-faced man with prematurely gray hair looked toward Mary with an expression of such kindness that it immediately eased her nervous tension. The youngest of the 7 brothers appeared confident despite his relative youth, his dark eyes settling on Elizabeth with what seemed like relief at finding someone who appeared capable of matching his ambitions and determination. Father O'Connor gestured for the brides to approach the church steps. "Ladies, may I present the Blackwood brothers, your intended husbands, and the finest men in all of Colorado Territory." The 7 couples faced each other across a distance of perhaps 20 feet. 7 futures hanging in the balance of first impressions and mutual assessment. Grace felt her heart beating rapidly as she prepared to finally meet the man whose letters had convinced her to travel 2,000 miles and commit her life to a stranger. What none of the 7 brides could have imagined was that this moment of hopeful anticipation would be the last purely joyful memory they would ever associate with the Blackwood name. Within 72 hours, everything would change in ways so devastating that it would transform 7 hopeful brides into 7 determined widows united by grief and an unbreakable commitment to justice. Marcus Blackwood stepped forward from the line of brothers, his commanding presence immediately drawing attention from the assembled community. At 32, he possessed the weathered confidence of a man who had built an empire from wilderness, his dark eyes revealing both intelligence and something harder to define. His formal wedding attire could not disguise the calloused hands and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years spent working alongside his men rather than merely directing from comfort. "Miss Morrison," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them, "your journey was long, but I trust the mountains provided adequate compensation for any discomfort." Grace curtsied slightly, her training in proper social behavior serving her well despite the unusual circumstances. "Mr. Blackwood, the scenery exceeded every description in your letters. Colorado Territory possesses a majesty that photographs cannot capture." Something flickered in Marcus's expression, gone too quickly to interpret, but he nodded approvingly. "The land demands respect, but it rewards those with vision and determination. I believe you possess both qualities." Daniel stepped forward next, his easy grin and relaxed manner creating an immediate contrast to his older brother's formal approach. "Miss Henderson, I see the adventurous spirit I detected in your letters wasn't exaggerated. That dress color shows proper disregard for conventional expectations." Clara smiled with genuine pleasure, her initial nervousness dissolving in response to his warmth. "Mr. Blackwood, I confess I chose it specifically because my aunt in Chicago declared it entirely inappropriate for a proper wedding. Your letters suggested you might appreciate someone willing to challenge arbitrary restrictions." "Absolutely correct," Daniel replied with obvious delight. "Life here requires practical thinking over social convention. I suspect you'll find frontier customs refreshingly direct." Benjamin approached Ruth with measured steps, his serious demeanor matching her own practical bearing. "Miss Campbell, your organizational skills will prove invaluable here. Managing operations of this scale requires someone who understands efficiency and planning." Ruth inclined her head respectfully. "Mr. Blackwood, I've spent considerable time developing systems for coordinating large households. I'm eager to apply those skills to help establish proper order and comfort for your family and workers." "Excellent," Benjamin replied with evident satisfaction. "The domestic aspects of our enterprise have required more attention than any of us can adequately provide. Your expertise will fill a crucial gap in our operations." Samuel removed his spectacles, cleaning them nervously before addressing Helen. "Miss Porter, I hope you'll find intellectual stimulation here despite our isolation. I've established a small library, and I'm eager to discuss the educational needs of our growing community." Helen's face brightened with genuine enthusiasm. "Mr. Blackwood, your letters indicated a commitment to learning that I find deeply admirable. The opportunity to establish educational institutions in a developing community represents exactly the challenge I've been seeking." "Wonderful," Samuel replied, replacing his spectacles with obvious relief. "I believe we'll find much common ground in our approach to building civilization in the wilderness." Nathan practically bounced forward, his restless energy barely contained by formal ceremony. "Miss Sullivan, I can already see the fire in your eyes that your letters promised. Business ventures here require courage and determination that conventional society rarely develops in women." Anna straightened proudly, meeting his enthusiastic gaze with equal intensity. "Mr. Blackwood, I've never been accused of lacking courage or determination. Your plans for commercial expansion sound precisely like the opportunities I've been preparing to pursue." "Perfect," Nathan exclaimed with obvious joy. Finally, a woman who understands that success requires taking calculated risks rather than accepting limitations imposed by others. Jonathan stepped forward with gentle dignity, his kind eyes immediately putting Mary at ease. "Miss O'Brien, your commitment to charitable work demonstrates the compassionate spirit our community desperately needs. There are many families here who would benefit from organized assistance." Mary's nervous tension melted away in response to his sincere manner. "Mr. Blackwood, the opportunity to establish meaningful charitable institutions while building a family represents everything I've hoped to accomplish with my life. I'm grateful Providence brought someone with your calling to our valley," Jonathan replied warmly. "Together, we can create programs that will serve families throughout the region." Alexander, despite his youth, approached Elizabeth with confidence that matched her own mature self-assurance. "Mrs. Hayes, your experience with frontier life and mining operations makes you uniquely qualified to help expand our business interests. I've been waiting for a partner who understands both the challenges and opportunities this country offers." Elizabeth smiled approvingly, recognizing in him the ambition and drive that had attracted her to his letters. "Mr. Blackwood, your plans for expansion demonstrate vision that requires experienced support. I'm eager to contribute my knowledge to help achieve those goals." "Excellent," Alexander replied with obvious satisfaction. "I believe we'll make formidable partners in both business and life." Father O'Connor beamed at the successful introductions, clearly pleased by the evident compatibility between the couples. "Now then, shall we proceed with the ceremony? The entire community has gathered to witness these blessed unions." The assembled crowd moved into St. Catherine's Church, its stone interior decorated with wildflowers and pine boughs gathered by local women for the occasion. Simple wooden pews accommodated the valley's residents, their work-worn faces reflecting genuine joy at witnessing such a significant celebration. The altar, carved from local pine and polished to golden warmth, provided a fitting focal point for the multiple ceremonies about to unfold. Margaret Winters had organized the seating arrangements with characteristic efficiency, ensuring that important community members had appropriate positions while still accommodating everyone who wished to attend. Dr. Rebecca Stone, the Valley's only physician, sat near the front with Judge William Crawford and his wife. Henry Ford, the telegraph operator whose absence from Denver had become a source of mild confusion, occupied a prominent position with other essential community leaders. The 7 couples arranged themselves before the altar in order of the brothers' ages, creating an impressive tableau of matrimonial commitment. Grace found herself studying Marcus's profile, noting the strong jaw and confident bearing that suggested someone accustomed to command. His hands, she observed, bore the scars and calluses that came from genuine physical labor, confirming that he worked alongside his men rather than merely directing from comfort. Father O'Connor opened the ceremony with a blessing that encompassed both the individual couples and the broader community they were joining. His rich Irish accent lent warmth to the traditional words, while his obvious affection for the Blackwood family added personal meaning to the formal proceedings. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying easily throughout the stone sanctuary, "we are gathered today to witness not just 7 marriages, but the foundation of 7 new families that will contribute to the growth and prosperity of our beloved valley. These unions represent hope for the future, the joining of different backgrounds and experiences in pursuit of common dreams. As the ceremony progressed through its traditional elements, Grace found herself genuinely moved by the solemnity and beauty of the moment. Marcus's responses were delivered with quiet dignity, his voice steady and sure as he made the promises that would bind their lives together. When he placed the simple gold band on her finger, his touch was gentle despite the obvious strength in his work-hardened hands. Clara practically glowed with happiness as she exchanged vows with Daniel, his easy charm and obvious delight in their union confirming her impression that she had found a man who would value her spirited nature rather than seek to constrain it. Their exchange of rings was accompanied by broad smiles that spoke of genuine mutual attraction and shared anticipation for their future together. Ruth and Benjamin approached their vows with the same practical seriousness they brought to other important matters, their promises delivered with conviction and mutual respect that suggested a partnership built on solid foundations rather than mere romantic fantasy. Their handclasp during the ring exchange spoke of two capable people committing to build something meaningful together. Helen and Samuel's ceremony possessed an almost scholarly quality, their careful attention to each word of the traditional vows reflecting their shared appreciation for language and meaning. When Samuel placed the ring on Helen's finger, he quoted softly from Shakespeare, bringing a delighted smile to her face and confirming their intellectual compatibility. Anna and Nathan practically sparkled with mutual enthusiasm, their exchange of vows delivered with energy and conviction that suggested two kindred spirits who had found perfect partners for their ambitious plans. Their rings were exchanged with obvious joy and the kind of confident handclasp that business partners might use to seal important agreements. Mary and Jonathan's ceremony possessed a gentle beauty that moved many observers to tears, their soft-spoken vows and tender exchange of rings reflecting the compassionate natures that had drawn them together across the vast distance separating Ohio from Colorado territory. Their union seemed blessed with the kind of spiritual harmony that promised lasting happiness. Elizabeth and Alexander, despite the bride's experience and the groom's youth, approached their vows with equal maturity and determination. Their promises were delivered with the kind of serious commitment that suggested two people who understood exactly what they were undertaking and possessed complete confidence in their ability to succeed together. As Father O'Connor pronounced the final blessing over all 7 couples, the congregation erupted in enthusiastic applause and celebration. The newlyweds turned to face their new community as married couples, creating a moment of pure joy that would remain forever etched in memory despite the darkness that lay ahead. Margaret Winters had prepared a reception in the church hall, its rough wooden walls decorated with more wildflowers and pine boughs that created a festive atmosphere. Despite the simple surroundings, long tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by families throughout the valley, their generous offerings reflecting both frontier hospitality and genuine affection for the Blackwood family. Dr. Rebecca Stone approached the newly married couples with warm congratulations, her professional demeanor softened by obvious pleasure at the day's celebrations. A woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent brown eyes, she had served the valley's medical needs for over a decade, earning universal respect for her skill and dedication. "Welcome to Millbrook Valley, ladies," she said warmly, addressing all 7 brides collectively. "I hope you'll find our community both welcoming and supportive. Frontier life presents unique challenges, but it also offers rewards that more settled areas cannot provide." Grace, speaking for the group as had become her natural role, responded with genuine appreciation. "Dr. Stone, we're grateful for your welcome. We've already observed the warmth and generosity of this community, and we're eager to contribute to its continued growth and prosperity." Judge William Crawford joined the conversation, his imposing figure and formal manner creating an immediate contrast to Dr. Stone's warmth. A tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that came from years of wielding authority in challenging circumstances. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, addressing Grace with the formal title that would take some adjustment, "I trust you and your fellow brides understand the significant responsibilities that come with your new positions in this community. The Blackwood family serves as an example and leader for the entire valley." Something in his tone suggested layers of meaning beyond mere social courtesy. But before Grace could respond, Marcus appeared at her side with protective timing that seemed almost too convenient. "Judge Crawford," Marcus said smoothly, "I'm sure my wife and her companions will contribute tremendously to our community's continued development. Their varied backgrounds and experiences bring exactly the kind of diversity our valley needs as it grows." The judge nodded approvingly, but continued to study the new brides with an intensity that seemed excessive for mere social curiosity. Indeed, diversity can be valuable when properly channeled. "I trust you'll ensure that all 7 families understand their obligations to maintain the stability and reputation that the Blackwood name represents." Elizabeth, drawing on her experience with frontier communities and their complex power dynamics, sensed undercurrents in the conversation that the other brides might miss. Her years as a widow managing mining claims had taught her to recognize when men were discussing matters beyond their stated words. "Judge Crawford," she said with careful diplomacy, "we all understand that our marriages represent not just personal unions but also responsibilities to the community that has welcomed us. We're committed to upholding the standards and values that have made Millbrook Valley prosperous." The judge's expression suggested satisfaction with her response, but his continued attention to all 7 brides indicated ongoing assessment rather than mere social pleasantry. Alexander appeared beside Elizabeth with the same protective timing that Marcus had displayed, creating a pattern that began to seem more coordinated than coincidental. Henry Ford, the telegraph operator, joined the growing group around the new couples, his nervous energy and darting glances suggesting anxiety that seemed disproportionate to a wedding celebration. A thin man in his 30s with prematurely balding hair and restless hands, he possessed the kind of jumpy demeanor that came from handling too much sensitive information. "Congratulations to all the happy couples," he said with forced cheer that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I hope the ladies will find our telegraph services useful for maintaining contact with family back east. Communication is so important for folks adjusting to frontier life." Anna, with her natural business instincts, immediately recognized the practical value of his offer. "Mr. Ford, that's very thoughtful. How frequently do telegraph services operate between here and major eastern cities?" Ford's hands fluttered nervously as he responded. "Daily service to Denver, twice weekly to Chicago and New York, depending on weather and line conditions. Of course, certain types of messages require special handling for privacy and security." The emphasis on privacy and security seemed oddly specific for a general offer of telegraph services. But before Anna could pursue the matter, Nathan smoothly redirected the conversation toward more general community topics. As the reception continued, the 7 new couples mingled with their neighbors, gradually building the relationships that would define their place in the valley's social structure. The Blackwood brothers demonstrated remarkable skill at managing conversations, ensuring that their wives met important community members while avoiding potentially sensitive topics. Victoria Ashford, a wealthy widow whose elegant dress and sophisticated manner distinguished her from other community members, approached the group with the confidence of someone accustomed to social leadership. In her 50s with silver hair and sharp green eyes, she possessed the kind of refined bearing that suggested education and prosperity, far beyond typical frontier standards. "My dear brides," she said warmly, "welcome to what I hope you'll find a surprisingly civilized corner of the frontier. I've established a small salon where educated women gather monthly to discuss literature, current events, and cultural matters. I do hope you'll join us." Helen's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm at the prospect of intellectual companionship. "Mrs. Ashford, that sounds wonderful. We'd be delighted to participate in such gatherings. Excellent, Victoria replied with obvious pleasure. Our next gathering is scheduled for Saturday evening. We'll be discussing recent developments in women's education and their implications for frontier communities. Ruth, ever practical, asked the logical follow-up question. Mrs. Ashford, how many women typically attend these gatherings? We're eager to meet other educated ladies in the community. Victoria's expression grew slightly evasive. The group varies depending on circumstances, but we maintain consistent quality of discussion despite fluctuating numbers. I'm confident you'll find the conversation stimulating regardless of attendance. Something in her response suggested that maintaining the group's existence required more effort than she was acknowledging, but the implications weren't clear enough to pursue without seeming rude. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the 7 brothers began indicating that it was time to depart for their respective homes. The ranch operations required constant attention, and the newly married couples needed time to begin adjusting to their changed circumstances. Marcus approached Grace with courtly formality, offering his arm for escort to their waiting carriage. Mrs. Blackwood, if you're ready, I'd like to show you our home before darkness falls. The main house sits on a rise that provides views of the entire valley. Grace accepted his escort with nervous anticipation, realizing that the public ceremony was ending and the private reality of marriage was about to begin. As they walked toward the carriage, she noticed that all 7 brothers were departing simultaneously, their wives beside them in what seemed like carefully coordinated timing. The Blackwood carriages formed an impressive procession as they departed St. Catherine's Church, their matched horses and elegant vehicles reflecting the family's prosperity and attention to maintaining proper appearances. Grace found herself sharing a carriage with Marcus, the first time they had been truly alone since meeting that afternoon. Your letters prepared me for much, she said carefully, but experiencing this community firsthand reveals complexities that correspondence couldn't capture. Marcus studied her with those dark eyes that seemed to assess everything. Frontier communities develop their own customs and necessities, often different from Eastern expectations. I trust you're adaptable enough to appreciate local realities. Something in his phrasing suggested that adaptation might be required rather than merely helpful, but Grace decided to interpret his comment positively. I've always believed that understanding local customs demonstrates respect for the people who develop them. Wise perspective, Marcus replied approvingly. Wisdom will serve you well here. The carriage climbed steadily through pine forests and open meadows, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across landscape of breathtaking beauty. As they crested a ridge, the Blackwood Ranch spread below them in magnificent display of prosperity and careful planning. The main house dominated the scene, a substantial 2-story structure built from local stone and timber that managed to project both strength and elegance. Outbuildings scattered across the immediate area included barns, workshops, storage facilities, and housing for workers, all constructed with the same attention to quality and permanence that characterized the main residence. It's magnificent, Grace breathed, genuinely impressed by the scope and organization of the operation. Your letters describe the ranch, but seeing it reveals the true scale of what you've accomplished. Marcus's expression showed satisfaction at her reaction. 15 years of planning and hard work created what you see. Every building serves multiple purposes. Every improvement strengthens the whole operation. As their carriage approached the main house, Grace observed details that spoke of thoughtful design and substantial investment. Gardens provided both beauty and practical vegetables, while carefully planned landscaping created attractive approaches. That also served defensive purposes by maintaining clear sightlines in all directions. Daniel's carriage followed close behind, carrying Clara, whose excited commentary could be heard even over the rumble of wheels and hoofbeats. Her enthusiasm for her new surroundings was infectious, and Grace found herself smiling at the younger woman's obvious delight with everything she observed. The remaining 5 carriages maintained steady intervals behind them, creating a procession that announced the arrival of the new families to anyone observing from the ranch buildings. Workers emerged from various structures to watch the passage of their employers and the new women who would help manage their community. As Marcus assisted Grace from their carriage before the main house, she noticed that servants were emerging to handle luggage and prepare for the evening's activities. The staff moved with efficient precision that spoke of well-established routines and clear authority structures. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," Marcus said formally, his words carrying weight that extended beyond mere courtesy. Grace looked up at the imposing structure that would now be her permanent residence, feeling a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty about the life she was about to begin. The day had exceeded her expectations in many ways, yet she sensed complexities and undercurrents that remained unexplored. What she could not have imagined was that within 48 hours, this impressive home would become something entirely different. A place where 7 widows would gather to plan the most elaborate revenge scheme the Colorado Territory had ever witnessed, united by grief so profound that it would transform their initial hopes for happiness into an unbreakable commitment to justice. The main house welcomed Grace with an interior that spoke of prosperity achieved through careful planning rather than inherited wealth. The front parlor displayed furniture crafted from local pine and walnut, their simple lines enhanced by quality. Fabrics that suggested someone with educated taste had overseen the decorating. Oil paintings depicting mountain landscapes adorned the walls, while a massive stone fireplace dominated one end of the room with comfortable seating arranged to encourage conversation. Marcus guided her through rooms that revealed increasing complexity beneath their surface simplicity. The dining room accommodated a table for 16, suggesting regular entertaining despite their frontier location. The kitchen, glimpsed through a doorway, appeared large enough to feed a substantial household, with modern conveniences that seemed remarkable for such a remote location. The house was designed to serve multiple functions, Marcus explained as they climbed the staircase crafted from polished pine. Family residence, business headquarters, and community gathering place when necessary. Isolation requires buildings that can adapt to changing circumstances. The upstairs hallway led past several bedrooms before stopping at double doors that Marcus opened with obvious pride. "Our rooms," he said simply, stepping aside to allow Grace to enter first. The master suite exceeded anything Grace had imagined, with windows facing east toward the mountains and furnishings that balanced masculine functionality with feminine comfort. A sitting area near the windows provided space for reading or correspondence, while the bedroom itself was dominated by a massive 4-poster bed crafted from local timber. "It's beautiful," Grace said sincerely, noting personal touches that suggested Marcus had prepared carefully for her arrival. Fresh flowers adorned the sitting area, and several books on the side table indicated knowledge of her reading preferences, gleaned from their correspondence. "I hoped you would find it acceptable," Marcus replied, his formal manner softening slightly. "The mountain views are particularly striking at sunrise, which your letters indicated you enjoyed." Grace moved to the east-facing windows, marveling at the panoramic vista of peaks and valleys stretching toward the horizon. "The scenery surpasses every description. I can see why you chose this location for the house." Marcus joined her at the window, his presence both reassuring and intimidating. The location provides security as well as beauty. Clear sightlines in all directions, defensive positions if needed, and escape routes through the mountains if circumstances require them. The mention of defensive considerations and escape routes seemed oddly specific for a prosperous ranch, but Grace assumed such precautions were normal for frontier properties where conflicts with hostile parties remained possible threats. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Marcus called permission to enter, and a middle-aged woman appeared carrying a tray of coffee and light refreshments. "Mrs. Blackwood," Marcus said formally, "may I present Mrs. Catherine Mueller, our housekeeper and the person who ensures this household operates smoothly. Catherine, this is my wife, Grace." Catherine Mueller curtsied respectfully, her German accent noticeable as she spoke. "Welcome, Mrs. Blackwood. I have prepared everything for your comfort, and I am available whenever you need assistance adjusting to your new home." Grace accepted the introduction graciously, immediately recognizing Catherine's competence and the respect she obviously commanded from Marcus. "Thank you, Mrs. Mueller. I'm eager to learn how the household operates and how I might contribute to its efficiency." Catherine's expression showed approval at Grace's practical approach. "I will be pleased to explain our routines and systems, Mrs. Blackwood. With proper understanding, you will find everything runs quite smoothly." After Catherine departed, Marcus and Grace settled in the sitting area with their coffee, the first opportunity for private conversation since their meeting at the church. Grace found herself studying her new husband more carefully, noting details that formal introductions hadn't revealed. Marcus possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of outdoor work combined with natural good looks. His dark hair showed threads of premature silver, while lines around his eyes spoke of someone who spent considerable time squinting against mountain sun and wind. His hands, wrapped around the delicate coffee cup, showed the scars and calluses that confirmed his active participation in ranch work. "Grace," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I realize our situation is unusual. Most couples have opportunities for extended courtship before marriage, while we've committed our lives based on correspondence and first impressions." Grace appreciated his directness. "I've considered that challenge extensively, Marcus, but I believe our letters revealed character and values more honestly than many conventional courtships allow. We've discussed practical matters, intellectual interests, and personal goals with remarkable candor." "True," Marcus agreed, though something in his expression suggested reservations he wasn't voicing. "Still, frontier life presents circumstances that are difficult to explain in letters. Some realities can only be understood through direct experience." Before Grace could ask what specific realities he meant, voices from outside drew their attention to the windows. The other Blackwood carriages were arriving at various outbuildings, their occupants dismounting at what appeared to be separate residences scattered across the ranch property. "Do all your brothers live on the ranch?" Grace asked, watching, as Daniel assisted Clara from their carriage near a smaller house perhaps a quarter-mile away. "Each couple has their own residence," Marcus explained, "but we coordinate our activities closely. The ranch operates as a single enterprise despite housing multiple families." Grace observed that the separate houses were positioned strategically, each offering privacy while maintaining clear sight lines to the others. The arrangement suggested careful planning for both practical cooperation and defensive considerations. As evening shadows lengthened across the valley, Marcus excused himself to check on ranch operations that required his attention despite the day's celebrations. Grace used the time alone to unpack her belongings and begin familiarizing herself with her new surroundings. The wardrobe Marcus had provided proved spacious enough for her modest collection of dresses, while drawers contained personal items she had shipped ahead during their correspondence. Everything had been arranged with careful attention to her preferences, suggesting Marcus had studied her letters far more thoroughly than mere politeness required. A writing desk near the sitting area windows contained quality paper, ink, and pens that would allow her to maintain correspondence with family and friends in Boston. Grace settled at the desk to compose a letter announcing her safe arrival and successful marriage, but found herself struggling to describe her impressions of Marcus and the community she had joined. Her husband appeared competent, prosperous, and appropriately attentive, yet something in his manner suggested complexities she hadn't yet understood. The ranch operations impressed her with their scope and organization, but the defensive considerations he mentioned seemed excessive for typical frontier concerns. A knock at the door interrupted her letter writing. Catherine Mueller appeared carrying a tray with dinner for two and an apology from Marcus for his continued absence. "Mr. Blackwood sends his regrets, Mrs. Blackwood," Catherine explained as she arranged the meal on the sitting area table. "Urgent matters with the cattle require his immediate attention, but he hopes to join you before the evening concludes." Grace accepted the explanation gracefully, though she found it curious that urgent cattle matters would arise on his wedding day. "Mrs. Mueller, might I ask about the ranch operations? I'm eager to understand how such a large enterprise functions." Catherine's expression grew cautious. "The ranch employs many men and serves various purposes, Mrs. Blackwood. Mr. Marcus manages everything with great skill, ensuring that all aspects operate smoothly and profitably." The careful phrasing suggested that Catherine had been instructed to avoid specific details about ranch operations, at least until Grace had been properly integrated into the family structure. Grace filed this observation away for future consideration. After dinner, Grace prepared for bed despite Marcus's continued absence, assuming that frontier life would require adjusting to irregular schedules based on livestock and weather demands. She had just changed into her nightgown when the sound of multiple horses approaching the main house drew her to the windows. Marcus and his 6 brothers were returning together, their horses lathered with sweat that suggested hard riding rather than routine cattle checking. The men dismounted with urgent efficiency, their body language indicating serious concerns rather than casual ranch business. Grace watched from her darkened window as the 7 brothers gathered in a tight circle near the barn, their conversation too distant to overhear, but intense enough to suggest crisis rather than routine discussion. Whatever matters were being discussed appeared to require complete privacy from their new wives. After perhaps 20 minutes of urgent consultation, the brothers separated to return to their respective homes. Marcus entered the main house quietly, his footsteps on the stairs suggesting he was attempting to avoid disturbing Grace if she had already retired. Grace remained at the window, observing as lights appeared in the other houses scattered across the ranch property. Each residence showed signs of similar late evening conferences between husband and wife, their shadows moving past windows in patterns that suggested serious conversations rather than romantic wedding night intimacies. When Marcus finally entered their bedroom, his expression showed the kind of tension that came from difficult decisions rather than wedding day joy. He moved carefully, clearly trying to avoid waking her if she had fallen asleep. "Marcus," Grace said softly from her position by the window, "is everything all right? You seemed troubled by whatever matters required your attention." Marcus paused in removing his jacket, his expression showing surprise at finding her awake and observant. Ranch business sometimes demands immediate attention, regardless of personal circumstances. "I apologize for the disruption to our wedding evening." Grace approached him with the kind of calm directness that had served her well during her father's medical crises. What kind of ranch business requires all 7 brothers to ride out together on their wedding day? And what kind of matters demand such intense private consultation afterward? Marcus studied her carefully, clearly assessing how much information to share with his new wife. "Grace, frontier life involves complexities that take time to understand. Some situations require experience to properly evaluate." The evasive response confirmed Grace's growing suspicion that significant matters were being concealed from the new wives. "Marcus, I've managed complex situations before. My father's medical practice involved life and death decisions, financial crises, and community conflicts. I'm not a delicate flower who requires protection from difficult realities." Something in Marcus's expression shifted, suggesting that her response had revealed capabilities he hadn't fully recognized. "The situation we're monitoring involves potential threats to ranch security. Nothing immediate, but circumstances that require vigilance and preparation." Grace accepted this partial explanation while recognizing that significant details were still being withheld. "What kind of threats? Cattle rustlers?" Conflicts with neighboring ranches? Problems with workers? Marcus hesitated before responding, clearly weighing his words carefully. All ranching operations face various challenges, Grace. Successful management requires anticipating problems before they become crises. The continued evasiveness suggested that whatever threats they faced were more serious than typical frontier challenges, but Grace recognized that pressing for details might damage the trust they were trying to build in their new marriage. Meanwhile, similar conversations were occurring in the other 6 houses scattered across the ranch property. Clara had observed Daniel's late return and tense demeanor, her journalistic instincts immediately recognizing that important information was being withheld. Ruth had noted Benjamin's careful avoidance of specifics about the evening's activities, while Helen detected the scholarly precision with which Samuel chose his words to reveal minimum information. Anna's business experience had taught her to recognize when partners were concealing significant matters, and Nathan's obviously forced casualness failed to disguise his underlying tension. Mary's compassionate nature sensed Jonathan's genuine distress despite his attempts to maintain normal behavior, while Elizabeth's frontier experience immediately identified the signs of serious trouble that Alexander was trying to minimize. The 7 new wives found themselves in identical situations, married to men who were clearly facing significant challenges while maintaining careful facades of normal ranch operations. Each woman responded according to her personality and experience, but all recognized that their wedding day had concluded with more questions than answers. Grace lay awake long after Marcus had fallen into restless sleep beside her, listening to sounds from the ranch that seemed inconsistent with routine nighttime activities. Horses moved past the house at regular intervals, voices carried on the mountain air with tones suggesting coordination rather than casual conversation, and lights in various outbuildings indicated work continuing far past normal hours. Whatever challenges the Blackwood brothers faced, they clearly required constant vigilance and careful planning. The defensive considerations Marcus had mentioned began to seem less like frontier paranoia and more like practical necessities for people facing genuine threats. In the other houses, 6 other new wives were reaching similar conclusions about their circumstances. The wedding day that had begun with such hope and promise was ending with the recognition that they had married into situations far more complex and potentially dangerous than their courtship correspondence had revealed. Clara pressed her face to the bedroom window, watching shadows move between buildings with military precision that seemed excessive for cattle ranch operations. Ruth lay in bed cataloging inconsistencies between Benjamin's letters describing peaceful ranch life and the evidence of organized activity suggesting preparation for conflict. Helen used her trained observation skills to analyze Samuel's careful word choices and obvious anxiety, recognizing patterns that indicated serious concerns about security and safety. Anna mentally reviewed Nathan's enthusiastic descriptions of business expansion plans, wondering how they reconciled with the defensive preparation she was observing. Mary offered prayers for guidance and protection, sensing that Jonathan's charitable work might be complicated by dangers he hadn't revealed in their correspondence. Elizabeth drew on her hard-won frontier experience to assess the security measures she observed, recognizing preparations that went far beyond protection against typical ranch hazards. As midnight approached, the unusual activities gradually subsided, leaving the 7 houses in apparent peaceful slumber. But each of the new wives had observed enough to understand that their wedding day had been marked by circumstances that their husbands deemed too sensitive or dangerous to explain to their new brides. What none of the 7 women could have anticipated was that within 24 hours, all their questions about mysterious ranch activities and defensive preparations would be answered in the most devastating way possible. The threats that their husbands were so carefully monitoring were about to materialize in a tragedy so complete that it would transform 7 hopeful new wives into 7 determined widows united by grief and an unbreakable commitment to justice. The morning sun would rise on scenes of destruction so thorough that it would take days to comprehend the full scope of what had been lost. And in the aftermath of that tragedy, the 7 women who had spent their wedding night puzzling over mysterious activities would discover that all their observations had been preparation for a confrontation that their husbands had lost, with consequences that would echo through the Colorado Territory for years to come. Dawn broke over Millbrook Valley with an unusual crimson sky that painted the mountains in shades of blood and fire. Grace woke to find Marcus already dressed and standing at the window, his posture rigid with tension as he studied the approaching sunrise. She had learned during her years assisting her father that men facing serious trouble often displayed such alertness in the early morning hours, as if daylight might bring challenges that darkness had temporarily held at bay. "The sky seems unusually red," Grace observed quietly, not wanting to startle him from his intense observation of the landscape. Marcus turned toward her, his expression showing the kind of controlled concern that suggested decisions had been made during the night. Mountain weather can change quickly. The color often indicates atmospheric disturbances that affect visibility and travel conditions. Something in his careful explanation suggested that weather concerns were not his primary worry, but Grace had learned that pressing for details too early in their relationship might damage the trust they were still building. Instead, she rose and began preparing for the day, noting that Marcus was dressing in work clothes rather than the more formal attire he had worn during their courtship. "Will you be working with the cattle today?" she asked, attempting to understand his plans and the household routines she would need to accommodate. Marcus hesitated before responding, his hands pausing in the act of fastening his gun belt. The weapon itself was more substantial than Grace had expected, suggesting purposes beyond protection from mountain wildlife. "Various matters require attention," he said finally. "Catherine will help you understand household routines and introduce you to the other wives. I suspect you'll find much in common with women who've made similar adjustments to frontier life." The suggestion that she spend time with the other wives while he attended to mysterious business confirmed Grace's growing suspicion that the Blackwood brothers were coordinating activities that required privacy from their new families. She accepted the arrangement with apparent compliance while mentally noting details that might prove significant. Later, after Marcus departed with a brief kiss and reassurances about returning for midday dinner, Grace dressed carefully and made her way downstairs to find Catherine Mueller preparing breakfast with efficient precision. The housekeeper's manner suggested she had been expecting instructions about managing the new mistress of the house. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood," Catherine said respectfully. "I have prepared breakfast and received word from the other households that the ladies are eager to meet properly now that the wedding festivities have concluded." Grace accepted coffee and fresh bread while considering this information. Are such gatherings common among the Blackwood wives? I imagine frontier isolation makes female companionship particularly valuable. Catherine's expression grew carefully neutral. The ladies often find comfort in each other's company, especially during times when the men's work requires extended absences from the households. The emphasis on extended absences suggested that whatever activities currently occupied the Blackwood brothers might continue for some time, requiring the wives to develop independence and mutual support more quickly than typical frontier marriages might demand. A knock at the kitchen door interrupted their conversation. Catherine admitted Clara Henderson Blackwood, whose bright energy seemed slightly forced despite her obvious attempts to maintain wedding day enthusiasm. "Grace!" Clara exclaimed with determinedly cheerful greeting. "I've been so eager to speak with you properly." Daniel suggested that we wives might enjoy exploring the ranch together while the men handle various business matters. Grace noted the careful phrasing that avoided specifics about what business matters might require all 7 brothers' simultaneous attention. "That sounds wonderful, Clara. I'm eager to understand our new home and meet everyone properly." Within the hour, all 7 new wives had gathered in the main house parlor, their individual personalities creating an interesting dynamic despite their shared circumstances. Ruth Campbell Blackwood arrived with characteristic efficiency, carrying a basket of fresh bread as a contribution to their impromptu gathering. Helen Porter Blackwood brought books she thought might interest the group, while Anna Sullivan Blackwood appeared with business ledgers she claimed to have borrowed from Nathan for educational purposes. Mary O'Brien Blackwood entered quietly, her gentle manner unchanged despite obvious fatigue that suggested little sleep following the wedding celebrations. Elizabeth Hayes Blackwood possessed the composed demeanor of someone drawing on previous frontier experience to assess their new circumstances with practical objectivity. Grace observed that despite their different backgrounds and personalities, all 7 women shared a common alertness that suggested they had each noticed inconsistencies between their husbands' described ranch life and the realities they were beginning to observe. "Ladies," Grace said, assuming her natural role as group spokesperson, "perhaps we should begin by sharing our impressions of our new home and discussing how we might best support each other as we adjust to life here." Ruth nodded approvingly. "Practical cooperation will benefit everyone. I've already observed that the ranch operations involve far more complexity than typical farming or cattle raising." Anna leaned forward with obvious interest. "Exactly what I was thinking." Nathan mentioned business partnerships and commercial contracts that seem unusually sophisticated for a frontier ranch, regardless of its size. Helen adjusted her spectacles thoughtfully. Samuel spoke extensively about educational and cultural development plans, but the library he showed me contains books on subjects that seem more relevant to military strategy than ranch management. Elizabeth, drawing on her hard-won frontier experience, voiced what several others had observed but hesitated to mention. "The defensive preparations throughout this property exceed anything I've seen at other ranches, including those facing genuine threats from hostile parties." Mary's gentle voice carried underlying concern as she added her observations. "Jonathan mentioned charitable works and community support, but the workers I've glimpsed seem more like soldiers than typical ranch hands." Clara's journalistic instincts had been cataloging discrepancies since her arrival. Daniel described cattle operations and mining activities, but the equipment and facilities I've observed suggest capabilities far beyond what such enterprises would require. The 7 women looked at each other with growing recognition that their individual observations painted a collective picture of circumstances far more complex than any of their husbands had revealed during their courtship correspondence. Grace chose her words carefully. "It appears we've all married men whose activities involve more than routine ranching. The question is whether we should be concerned about matters they've chosen not to explain to us." Ruth's practical nature led her to the obvious conclusion. Frontier life often involves dangers and challenges that Eastern women might find overwhelming. Perhaps our husbands believe they're protecting us by avoiding details that might cause unnecessary worry. Anna's business experience suggested a different interpretation. Or they're involved in activities that would be difficult to explain to wives they've known for less than 24 hours. Some enterprises require establishing trust before revealing full details. Elizabeth's frontier wisdom provided the most sobering assessment. "In my experience, when men go to elaborate lengths to conceal their activities from their families, those activities usually involve significant risks that affect everyone's safety." Helen's scholarly approach led her to organize their observations systematically. "Perhaps we should catalog what we've observed and compare those details with what our husbands described in their letters. Discrepancies might reveal patterns that explain our concerns." Mary's compassionate nature focused on the emotional aspects of their situation. "Whatever challenges our husbands face, we're now part of their lives and should share their burdens, rather than being protected from them." Clara's adventurous spirit embraced the mystery with enthusiasm that worried some of the more cautious wives. I find the complexity intriguing rather than troubling. We came west seeking adventure and new experiences, and we've certainly found circumstances more interesting than routine frontier domesticity. As the women shared their individual observations, a clearer picture emerged of an operation that extended far beyond cattle ranching and mining. The defensive preparations, sophisticated equipment, carefully trained workers, and military-style coordination suggested activities that might explain why the Blackwood family had achieved such prosperity and influence in a relatively short time. Grace found herself remembering details from Marcus's letters that had seemed merely descriptive at the time, but now suggested deeper significance. His references to building something meaningful in the wilderness, his emphasis on loyalty and trust among his associates, and his careful questions about her ability to handle challenging circumstances had perhaps been more revealing than she had understood. "We need more information before drawing conclusions," Grace said finally. "But I suggest we remain observant and share our observations with each other. Whatever our husbands are involved in, we're now part of this community and deserve to understand our circumstances." The other wives agreed to maintain regular communication and support each other as they gathered additional information about their new home and husbands' activities. Their individual skills and backgrounds would prove valuable for understanding different aspects of the complex situation they had discovered. As their gathering concluded, Catherine Mueller appeared in the parlor doorway with an expression that immediately commanded attention. Her usual composed demeanor showed cracks of anxiety that suggested urgent matters requiring immediate discussion. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said, addressing Grace as the senior wife, "I have received word that all the gentlemen will be absent until late evening, possibly overnight. They have left instructions for the households to maintain normal routines while they attend to pressing business matters." Grace exchanged glances with the other wives, recognizing that whatever activities had occupied their husbands the previous evening were escalating into situations requiring extended absence from their families. "Did they indicate the nature of these business matters?" Ruth asked with her characteristic directness. Catherine's expression grew more guarded. "Ranch security and property protection, Mrs. Blackwood. Matters that require the attention of all 7 brothers working together." Elizabeth's frontier experience immediately recognized the significance of such coordination. What kind of threats would require all 7 men to respond simultaneously? Are we talking about cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, or something more serious? Catherine hesitated before responding, clearly weighing her loyalty to the Blackwood family against her responsibilities to their new wives. "There have been reports of organized groups in the region, Mrs. Blackwood, men who target successful operations for various reasons." Anna's business instincts immediately grasped the implications. "You're describing protection rackets or claim jumping operations sophisticated enough to threaten an enterprise of this size and influence." Helen's analytical mind processed the information systematically. "Such threats would explain the defensive preparations we've observed, as well as the military-style organization among the workers." Mary's compassionate nature focused on the human costs of such conflicts. Are families in danger? Should we be taking precautions to protect ourselves and the workers' children? Clara's adventurous spirit was tempered by growing understanding of the serious nature of their circumstances. How long have these threats been developing? Were our husbands facing these dangers during our courtship correspondence? Catherine's carefully controlled expression suggested that the threats were both serious and long-standing. "The Blackwood family has always prioritized security, Mrs. Blackwood. Recent developments have simply required increased vigilance and preparation." Grace recognized that Catherine was providing as much information as her loyalty to the family allowed while avoiding details that might compromise security or operations. "Catherine, What should we do to support our husbands and protect ourselves while they're handling these matters? Maintain normal household routines, Mrs. Blackwood. Catherine replied with obvious relief at being asked practical questions, rather than pressed for sensitive details. Stay close to the main buildings, avoid traveling alone, and report any unusual activities or visitors immediately. The instructions confirmed that the situation involved genuine dangers that could affect the families, not merely business challenges that required the men's attention. The 7 wives found themselves facing their second day of marriage with the recognition that they had committed their lives to men whose activities involved risks that extended far beyond typical frontier challenges. As afternoon shadows lengthened, across the valley, the wives took turns visiting each other's homes while staying within the secure perimeter that the ranch's defensive preparations had established. Each residence revealed similar evidence of careful planning for both comfort and security, with features that could serve defensive purposes while maintaining appearances of normal domestic arrangements. Grace found herself studying the valley's geography with new eyes, recognizing how the Blackwood Ranch's location provided both strategic advantages and potential vulnerabilities. The clear sightlines that offered beautiful views also allowed early detection of approaching threats, while the mountain passes that provided access to the outside world could be controlled or blocked if necessary. Evening brought no word from the absent husbands, leaving 7 worried wives to maintain household routines while wondering about the nature and seriousness of the threats their men were confronting. Catherine Mueller and the other senior household staff maintained reassuring efficiency while clearly following emergency protocols that suggested experience with such situations. As darkness fell over Millbrook Valley, Grace stood at her bedroom window, observing the subtle security measures that became more obvious after dark. Guards moved between buildings with military precision, while signals passed between watchers positioned at strategic points throughout the property. Whatever challenges the Blackwood brothers faced, they clearly commanded resources and loyalty that extended far beyond typical ranch operations. The question remained whether their sophisticated defensive preparations and carefully trained personnel would prove adequate against the threats that had required their urgent attention. In the distance, the crimson sunset that had marked the morning's beginning gave way to an ominous darkness that seemed to press against the valley's boundaries. Grace found herself offering prayers for her husband's safety while preparing mentally for news that might change everything about the life she had just begun to build. What she could not have imagined was that by the next sunrise, all her questions about mysterious activities and defensive preparations would be answered in the most devastating way possible. The threats that had drawn all 7 Blackwood brothers away from their new wives were about to materialize in a tragedy so complete that it would transform 7 hopeful new brides into 7 determined widows united by grief and an unbreakable commitment to justice. The screaming began at dawn. Grace jolted awake to Catherine Muller's anguished cries echoing through the main house, followed by the thundering of horses approaching at desperate speed. She rushed to the window to see a lone rider galloping toward the house, his horse lathered with sweat and his clothes torn and bloodied. Within minutes, similar scenes erupted at all 7 houses scattered across the ranch property. Riders brought word that would shatter the lives of 7 women who had been brides for barely 48 hours. The Blackwood brothers were dead. All 7, slaughtered in an ambush at Devil's Canyon while attempting to negotiate with the organized gang that had been threatening their operations. Their bodies lay scattered among the pine trees, victims of a betrayal so complete that none had survived to warn the others. Grace sank to her knees as the devastating news reached her, the riders' broken words painting a picture of carnage that defied comprehension. Marcus, Daniel, Benjamin, Samuel, Nathan, Jonathan, and Alexander Blackwood had ridden out together to face their enemies and had been cut down like wheat before a scythe. Across the ranch property, 6 other women received identical news from 6 other blood-soaked messengers. Clara collapsed against Daniel's writing desk, her adventurous spirit crushed beneath the weight of sudden widowhood. Ruth sat frozen in her kitchen, her practical mind struggling to process the impossibility of managing a household for a husband who would never return. Helen removed her spectacles with trembling hands, her scholarly composure shattered by the brutal reality that no amount of education could have prepared her to face. Anna stared at Nathan's business ledgers, their careful calculations rendered meaningless by violence that had destroyed every plan and ambition. Mary fell to her knees, in prayer, her compassionate heart breaking for the 7 families whose providers had been torn away in a single morning's savagery. Elizabeth stood rigid at her window, her frontier experience confirming what the others couldn't yet comprehend. They were now 7 widows alone in a hostile territory with enemies who had demonstrated their willingness to kill. By midday, the bodies had been recovered and brought back to the ranch in wagons that seemed to stretch endlessly across the valley floor. The 7 brothers who had built an empire through determination and cooperation lay still and cold, their dreams of dynasty ended in the space of minutes. The funeral took place 3 days later at St. Catherine's Church, the same altar where they had spoken marriage vows, now witnessing final farewells. The entire valley attended, their faces reflecting shock and fear at the loss of the region's most powerful family. Father O'Connor's voice broke repeatedly as he attempted to offer comfort to 7 women, whose grief seemed too vast for human consolation. But as the last words were spoken over 7 fresh graves in Pine Ridge Cemetery, something fundamental shifted in the women who stood dressed in mourning black. The gentle brides who had arrived full of hope and romantic dreams were gone, replaced by 7 widows whose shared tragedy had forged bonds stronger than blood. Grace was the first to speak the words that would bind them together forever. "They will pay," she said quietly as earth fell onto Marcus's coffin. "Every man who participated in this massacre will answer for what they've done." Clara nodded, with grim determination that replaced her former cheerful optimism. Daniel died believing he was protecting his family and community. "We'll finish what they started." Ruth's practical mind immediately began calculating resources and possibilities. Benjamin left detailed records of their business dealings. Someone hired that gang, and the evidence will be in those files. Helen's analytical intelligence focused on the systematic approach required for justice. Samuel kept extensive correspondence with law enforcement agencies. "We'll find allies who shared their commitment to civilization." Anna's business acumen recognized the advantages their inherited wealth would provide. Nathan's commercial connections extend throughout the territory. "We have resources and influence that our enemies won't expect women to possess." Mary's compassionate nature transformed into steel-hard resolve. Jonathan believed in justice for all people. "We'll make sure his killers face the same justice they denied him." Elizabeth's frontier experience provided the grim expertise their mission would require. Alexander documented every threat and enemy they faced. "We know who ordered their deaths, and we know how to find them." The 7 widows stood together beside 7 graves, their individual strengths combining into something their enemies could never have anticipated. They possessed Marcus's strategic planning, Daniel's courage, Benjamin's organizational skills, Samuel's intelligence networks, Nathan's financial resources, Jonathan's moral authority, and Alexander's knowledge of their enemies' operations. Over the following weeks, they worked with methodical precision that would have made their husbands proud. Grace coordinated their efforts with the same leadership qualities that had made her natural spokesperson for the group. Clara used her journalistic skills to investigate connections between local officials and the criminal organization that had ordered the massacre. Ruth organized their resources with mathematical precision, ensuring they had supplies, weapons, and safe houses positioned throughout the territory. Helen analyzed intelligence with scholarly thoroughness, identifying patterns and weaknesses in their enemies' operations that law enforcement had missed. Anna managed their financial resources and business relationships, maintaining the appearance of grieving widows while secretly funding the most comprehensive revenge operation the Colorado Territory had ever witnessed. Mary used her connections with charitable organizations to gather information from communities throughout the region, her gentle manner concealing the deadly purpose behind her inquiries. Elizabeth applied her frontier experience to training the other women in survival skills and marksmanship, transforming grieving widows into a formidable force capable of operating in hostile territory. The first target was Judge William Crawford, whose corrupt rulings had protected the criminal organization in exchange for substantial bribes. They exposed his crimes through carefully leaked documents that destroyed his reputation and sent him fleeing the territory in disgrace. Henry Ford, the telegraph operator who had facilitated communications between the gang and their local accomplices, found his equipment mysteriously destroyed and his private correspondence, revealing his treachery, published in newspapers across Colorado Territory. Lawrence Preston, whose banking connections had laundered money for the criminal organization, discovered that his accounts had been frozen by federal investigators armed with evidence the widows had carefully compiled and delivered to honest authorities. One by one, every person who had contributed to the massacre faced consequences precisely calibrated to their level of involvement. Local merchants who had provided supplies found their businesses boycotted into bankruptcy. Politicians who had provided protection discovered their careers destroyed by revelations of corruption. Law enforcement officers who had ignored obvious crimes found themselves facing federal charges for dereliction of duty. But the 7 widows saved their most elaborate revenge for Victor Kane, the gang leader who had personally ordered their husbands' deaths. They tracked him across 3 states, using their combined resources and intelligence networks to anticipate his movements and corner him in a remote canyon where justice could be served without interference from corrupt officials. When Kane finally faced the 7 women whose lives he had destroyed, he discovered that grief had transformed them into something far more dangerous than the men he had killed. They had inherited not just wealth and influence, but also the deadly combination of their husbands' capabilities enhanced by their own unique skills and perspectives. The gang leader who had terrorized the territory for years found himself facing opponents who possessed patience, intelligence, and resources he had never encountered. The 7 widows had planned their revenge with such thoroughness that escape was impossible and mercy unthinkable. Kane died knowing that his organization had been completely destroyed, his associates either dead or imprisoned, and his influence eradicated from Colorado Territory. The 7 women who had arrived as hopeful brides and endured transformation into grieving widows had emerged as a force for justice that would be remembered throughout the frontier for generations. In the months that followed, the 7 widows established the Blackwood Foundation, using their inherited wealth to support law enforcement, education, and community development throughout Colorado Territory. They never remarried, dedicating their lives to ensuring that other families would never suffer the losses they had endured. Grace became a powerful advocate for women's rights and frontier justice, her leadership inspiring other women to demand protection and equality. Clara established newspapers that exposed corruption and championed honest government throughout the Western Territories. Ruth created educational institutions that provided practical training for frontier families, while Helen developed libraries and schools that brought learning to remote communities. Anna built business networks that supported honest enterprises and drove out criminal influence. Mary established charitable organizations that cared for widows and orphans, ensuring they received the support society often denied them. Elizabeth founded training programs that taught frontier survival skills and self-defense to women throughout the territory. The 7 sisters-in-law, united by tragedy and bonded by vengeance, had transformed their devastating loss into a legacy that would protect countless other families from similar fates. They had arrived in Millbrook Valley as strangers seeking individual happiness, but emerged as a sisterhood whose combined strength would reshape the frontier itself. Their husbands' dream of building civilization in the wilderness had been realized, but not in the way anyone could have anticipated. The 7 Blackwood brothers had created an empire through their own efforts, but their widows had built something greater, a foundation for justice and community that would endure long after the memory of individual tragedies had faded. Empty houses scattered across the ranch property stood as monuments to love destroyed by violence, but they also served as symbols of justice achieved through determination and sisterhood. 7 women who had lost everything had discovered that together they possessed the power to change everything. In Pine Ridge Cemetery, 7 graves received fresh flowers every week, placed there by 7 widows who had honored their husbands. Memories by completing the work they had begun. The men who had died believing they were protecting their families had been proven right. Their wives had indeed inherited the strength to carry on their mission. The Colorado Territory was a safer place because 7 mail-order brides had refused to accept that justice was impossible. They had transformed their grief into purpose, their loss into strength, and their individual pain into collective power that would protect generations of families yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.